Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about empathy.
I feel your pain, Bill Clinton said over and over again during his 1992 presidential campaign, but the phrase was mocked by many Americans who felt he lacked sincerity and real empathy.
So, it seems that saying you have empathy doesn't cut it. It's all about perception. So, empathy. What's the story?
We're always hearing that empathy means putting yourself in someone else's shoes and feeling others' emotions. But let's be clear, that's impossible.
The expressions, put yourself in her shoes, or think about how you would feel in his place, are dangerous, because in the end they rob the other of his or her difference, their right to be other, to be themselves. By using these expressions, we implicitly stop considering the other as he or she is. We stop seeing them as a person in their own right, with their own reasoning and feelings.
Instead, we take their place, or at least we pretend to. And now that we've crossed over, nothing prevents us from thinking and deciding for them. The other is no longer a subject, but an object. I, the benevolent chief happiness officer, know exactly what will make you happy. I know better than you, you little worm. Dictatorship is never far off.
As you can see, then, empathy cannot be defined as a human's ability to put herself in another person's shoes. Instead, it's about trying to perceive what the other is feeling.
Exactly. Empathy is all about perception. I'm not the other. I'm me, here, next to the other, and I perceive the information the other is conveying.
When it comes down to it, empathy is about meeting the other, being present with the other, really, truly present with them. Not just being in the same space at the same time.
It's thanks to that presence that their being unfolds. Thanks to that presence, they can fully express themselves.
In the end, the takeaway is that being empathetic depends on your ability to accept the presence of the other. It's about creating the conditions that promote shared presence. And there are 3 keys to doing that.
The first, without which nothing is possible, is to give the other space to express themselves, to convey information, whether by speaking or gesturing, whether explicit or implicit, etc. Communication can take on an infinite variety of forms, and all at once. And sometimes it can be contradictory, like when all of the signs a person is giving off contradict what he or she is saying.
Yes. And this is where key concepts like trust, listening, and respect are crucial.
Next, you have to be able to welcome the other's presence. In other words, your own senses have to be sufficiently honed and open to receive the information conveyed. Once again, it's about being open to taking in information from the other. Being attentive to someone means putting yourself in their service for a while.
But let us repeat that when we say to welcome the other's feelings, we don't mean you should imagine their feelings or project yours onto them. It's definitely not the time to imagine what the other is feeling or to feel it for them. It's just about receiving the information that the other is willing to share with us.
And that means that you have to be particularly lucid. That's the third key element. You have to be able to tell the difference between yourself and the other. You can't take possession of the other by shoving them into a box, gluing a label on their head, or describing them. Such attempts will lead nowhere.
Right. And this lucidity requires a certain amount of work on yourself. You have to become aware of your perceptive biases, which are numerous, and remain alert to avoid giving in to them.
Yes, and I would add that you also need distance. You have to see the other, as different from you, all while getting close enough to hear and understand them.
To recap, being empathetic isn't about putting yourself in someone else's shoes or feeling the other's feelings, because that's just not possible. Instead, it's about trying your best to perceive what the other is feeling. To do that, you have to 1. Create the proper conditions for the other to express what they're feeling. 2. Be sufficiently sensitive to perceive what they're conveying. And 3. Be lucid and distant enough to interpret it with the least possible amount of bias. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.